They showed up with fake badges and fake authority, thinking they could bully a black woman into submission. They were ready to force her off her own property, convinced she wouldn't dare fight back. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Stick around and tell us in comments where you're watching from. Vanessa Carter sat on her porch, savoring the quiet afternoon. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the distant hum of lawnmowers blended into the suburban stillness. She had worked hard for this moment, for this home, a place she had earned through years of dedication. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that she belonged anywhere she chose to be. But not everyone saw it that way. She had lived in Rosewood Estates for a little over a year, and in that time, she had become all too familiar with the unspoken rules of the neighborhood. It wasn't the neatly printed policies of the HOA that dictated who was welcome. It was the way certain people watched her. It was in the stares that lingered too long, the cold politeness of small talk that never turned into anything more. Some neighbors had come around, but others had made it clear she wasn't part of the original design. And no one embodied that sentiment more than Margaret Sterling. Margaret was the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood order, always carrying herself with the confidence of someone who believed she owned more than just her property. She had made a habit of policing everything, from how trash bins were arranged to how long someone's holiday decorations stayed up. She had weaponized community guidelines, bending them to her idea of what Rosewood Estates should look like. But today, Margaret was coming for more than a polite warning. Vanessa spotted her from the corner of her eye, marching down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. Two men in security uniforms flanking her like she was leading an official raid. There was no hesitation in her step, no casual pretense. She was here to exert authority, and she had brought backup to make sure she wouldn't be ignored. Vanessa exhaled, setting down her glass of tea. This was different. Margaret stopped just short of Vanessa's porch, her smugness evident in the way she straightened her shoulders. She wasn't just a neighbor today. She was someone who had convinced herself she was delivering justice. "Vanessa," Margaret began, her voice carrying that tone of forced politeness, the kind that was only used when someone felt completely in control. "I hate to disturb you, but we need to address your ongoing violations of the Homeowners Association policies. This has gone on long enough." Vanessa remained seated, her expression calm but unreadable. She had long since learned that people like Margaret hated silence. They needed a reaction, a flinch, something to validate their authority. She wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Margaret tapped her clipboard. "We've given you multiple warnings, but your property remains out of compliance. First, your lawn exceeds the approved grass height by more than half an inch. Second, your shutters are not within the HOA's authorized color palette. And third, your vehicle has been parked in your driveway for more than 48 consecutive hours, which directly violates Section 4 of the community regulations." She let the accusations settle, waiting for Vanessa to defend herself. Vanessa simply blinked. Grass? Shutters? Her own driveway? She had seen Margaret pull petty stunts before, but this wasn't just about rules, it was about control. Margaret shifted her stance, gesturing toward the two uniformed men beside her. "Since you've repeatedly failed to comply, I've had no choice but to escalate the matter. These officers are here to ensure that action is taken. If necessary, they are authorized to escort you off the property until the violations are corrected." That was when Vanessa finally looked at the men in security uniforms. They stood rigid, hands resting near their belts, giving the illusion of authority. Their navy blue outfits looked official enough, the kind that could pass as real law enforcement to someone who wasn't paying attention. But Vanessa was paying attention. She had spent enough time around actual law enforcement to know the difference. The way they stood, the way their badges lacked real identifiers, the way their radios weren't even turned on, everything about them screamed inauthentic. Margaret had gone through the trouble of hiring security guards, dressing them up, and hoping the mere sight of uniforms would be enough to intimidate her into submission. It would have worked on someone else. Vanessa almost felt sorry for her, almost. She let the silence stretch, watching as Margaret's smugness wavered just slightly. The woman had expected compliance. She had expected fear. Instead, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, her fingers tapping idly against the armrest. She let out a small breath before finally speaking. "You brought your own fake police to try and arrest me over my grass." Margaret's confidence faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "The rules apply to everyone, Vanessa. If we start making exceptions, the neighborhood falls into chaos." Vanessa exhaled, shaking her head slightly. And what's the official punishment for tall grass? Margaret smiled, regaining her footing. Removal. One of the fake officers took a small step forward, as if ready to act. The moment he moved, Vanessa's expression shifted, just enough to make him hesitate mid-step. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't even have to get up, but something in the air changed. It was an instinctive reaction, one that came not from fear, but from something far more powerful. It was authority. And that was when Margaret finally started to realize she had made a very, very big mistake. Margaret expected resistance, but not like this. She had come prepared for the usual excuses, the defensive back and forths, the nervous compliance she always managed to squeeze out of the less established homeowners. Instead, Vanessa Carter sat across from her with a calmness that was unnerving. It wasn't passive. It wasn't the silence of someone who didn't know what to say. It was deliberate, measured. It was the silence of someone who had already won. Margaret's carefully maintained confidence wavered for the first time. The two hired security guards at her side, men she had brought to ensure obedience, were no longer looking at Vanessa with the same certainty. They had expected her to argue, to flinch, to show signs of hesitation. But instead, she was just watching them. And it was starting to make them nervous. Margaret shifted on her feet, gripping her clipboard tighter. This isn't up for discussion, Vanessa. The HOA has the right to enforce community standards, and if you refuse to comply, these officers are authorized to take action. Vanessa tilted her head, as if she were considering the statement. Then she smiled. Take action? She echoed, voice even. And what exactly does that mean? The taller of the two security guards cleared his throat, stepping forward in what was meant to be an intimidating motion. Ma'am, we can remove you from the property if necessary. For the first time, Vanessa let out a short, humorless laugh. Remove me? She repeated, amusement flickering in her eyes. From my own home? The security guard hesitated. Margaret took over, her voice regaining a hint of its previous edge. The HOA has procedures, Vanessa. If a resident fails to comply with community guidelines, they can be escorted off the premises until the issue is resolved. Vanessa's smile didn't fade, but something in her expression sharpened. And you two? She said, looking at the guards now. You're here to enforce that? The shorter guard nodded stiffly. Yes, ma'am. She exhaled, nodding slowly. All right then. And with that, she reached for her phone. Margaret's smugness faltered immediately. What are you doing? Vanessa didn't answer. She pressed a button and brought the phone to her ear, speaking calmly into the receiver. Yes, I need a unit at Rosewood Estates. Possible impersonation of law enforcement, harassment, and attempted unlawful removal of a resident from their own property. Yes, I'll hold. The reaction was instantaneous. The two security guards tensed, their previous confidence disappearing in real time. The taller one shot Margaret a quick look, as if suddenly questioning what exactly he had signed up for. Margaret's entire posture stiffened. Wait, what? Vanessa lowered the phone, still holding it in her hand. Her eyes flickered over the men in uniform. You two should probably start asking yourselves a few questions, like who exactly hired you and whether or not what you're doing here is legal. The shorter guard took a slow step backward, unease creeping into his features. We were just doing a job, he muttered. Vanessa smirked. Yeah, and now you're realizing that you don't actually have the authority you were told you did. Margaret's entire face turned red. This is absolutely ridiculous. You can't just call the police over an HOA matter. Vanessa finally turned her full attention to her. Oh, but I can. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention. You see, Margaret, you don't actually have the right to forcibly remove anyone from their home. HOA policies aren't law, and hiring a couple of security guards, dressing them up like officers, and threatening a homeowner with removal? She tilted her head. That's fraud. Margaret's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. She hadn't expected this. She had expected Vanessa to argue about the HOA rules, to push back with legal jargon she could counter with official procedures. She hadn't expected the police to get involved. The shorter guard let out a breath, shaking his head. Margaret, you didn't say anything about this being illegal. It's not illegal, Margaret snapped, her frustration bubbling over. She is refusing to comply with the board. That's all this is. Vanessa lifted her phone again. You can explain that to the authorities. The taller guard clenched his jaw. You called actual police? Vanessa nodded once. I did. And they should be here any moment. Margaret Sterling had built her entire reputation on control, not the kind that came from actual authority, but from manipulation, intimidation, and a relentless belief that she was untouchable. For years, she had forced her neighbors into submission under the weight of community rules, making them second-guess their every decision, ensuring they never stepped out of line. But today, control had slipped through her fingers like sand. Sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood, an undeniable signal that the situation had escalated beyond Margaret's grasp. A real police cruiser pulled up in front of Vanessa's home, and as soon as the officer stepped out, his eyes immediately landed on her. And then he said it. "Director Carter?" Everything stopped. Margaret's face went ghost white, the clipboard in her hand trembling slightly. The two fake officers beside her stiffened, their expressions shifting from certainty to sheer panic. The taller one swallowed hard. "Wait, Director?" The shorter one took an instinctive step backward, suddenly realizing exactly how deep they had sunk. Vanessa took a slow breath, then finally spoke, her voice calm but edged with finality. "Took you long enough." Margaret was completely still now, like a woman who had just stepped off a cliff but hadn't hit the ground yet. The officer approached, his tone shifting into professional concern. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Vanessa exhaled, tilting her head toward Margaret and her hired guards. "That depends. We've got impersonation of law enforcement, harassment, and attempted unlawful removal of a homeowner from their own property. Does that sound like something you'd handle?" Margaret visibly flinched at the last words. The shorter security guard blurted out, "We didn't know who she was," as if that would somehow save him. Vanessa finally turned her full attention to them, taking a slow step forward. "That's the thing," she said smoothly. "You should've." Her voice was steady, deliberate, and carried the kind of weight that did not waver. "You see, Margaret," Vanessa continued, each word cutting deeper, "you've spent months trying to enforce rules that don't even exist. You've harassed people, twisted policies to fit your own agenda, and today?" She glanced at the security guards. "You tried to pull a power move on the wrong person." Margaret's lips parted, but nothing came out. Vanessa let the silence linger before delivering the final blow. "I don't just know the law, Margaret." Her smirk was razor sharp. "I am the law." She took another step forward, voice unwavering. "Vanessa Carter, FBI Director." The moment she said it, the air shifted entirely. The security guards looked like they wanted to disappear. The taller one exhaled shakily. "Oh, hell no." Margaret stumbled back a step, her mind scrambling for a way out. I didn't know." Vanessa smiled. "And that was your first mistake." The officer turned to Margaret, voice stern. "Ma'am, I need to know exactly who authorized this operation and whether you knowingly misled these men into impersonating law enforcement." Margaret looked ready to collapse. I was just ensuring compliance. This is all a misunderstanding." Vanessa let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Oh, it's very clear." Then she turned to the officer. "I'm pressing charges," Margaret gasped. And just like that, Margaret Sterling, the self-appointed ruler of Rosewood Estates, had fallen. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. The two security guards were arrested for impersonation of law enforcement. Their involvement was minimal compared to Margaret's, but their willingness to comply with a fraudulent directive cost them. Margaret was officially charged with harassment, fraud, and unlawful intimidation. Legal proceedings began within the week. The HOA board, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, voted unanimously to remove Margaret from any leadership role permanently. Her neighbors, once too afraid to challenge her, spoke out, bringing forward years of complaints against her. Her reputation? Destroyed. By the end of the month, Margaret was gone. Forced to sell her home, drowning in legal battles, her once unshakable influence erased overnight. And Vanessa? She stayed. She remained in her home, unbothered, untouched, and unshaken. She had no interest in revenge. Margaret had destroyed herself. And every so often, as she sat on her porch with a glass of sweet tea, she thought about how people like Margaret always made the same mistake. They mistook control for power. Control was fragile, a cheap trick, built on smoke and mirrors. It crumbled the moment it was tested. But power? Power was earned, and Vanessa Carter had earned every last bit of it. Have you ever faced someone who tried to control you with nothing but intimidation and empty threats? How did you handle it? Share your experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching,